Welcome back, everybody, and now we're going to get to the fun part. I will tell you that as beautiful as this quilt looks right now with all of the quilting on it, before we hung it on the wall, it was filled with marking. And I mark all of my quilts before I quilt them because I struggle with stitching straight lines, and so it really helps me to mark my quilts, and then I can see spatially how things are happening. So I'll give you an example. Across the outside border, and you always want to start from the top and work your way down, or from the side and work your way over. Never start at one end, flip it over, and do the other end. So we're going to work our way through the quilt. The one thing I want to mention is whether you're using the straight line BSR compatible ruler work attachments or whether you're doing free motion quilting, you always need to have a little bit of extra fabric on the outside edge of whatever project you're working on. Because the BSR sits a little bit behind the needle, if you don't have a piece of fabric or a little bit of the backing extra around that outside edge, it's not going to pick up and read the fabric, and you won't actually start stitching until you're on your quilt or on your project. And we want to start stitching, we want the machine to start stitching before we get there. And that's on the Bernina. If you have another machine that you like to use for quilting, it's probably the same idea. I always like to have a little bit of extra fabric around the outside edge. So we're going to start with marking our quilt because that's how you're going to make sure that you get a really consistent and perfect quilting on your quilt. Now, a couple of things to think about are what do you want to use for a marking tool? And I have grown very fond. On this quilt, I used a friction pen. I love the friction pens. I know some people have said, well, the fabric markings come back or it might leave a little bit of a residue, but my discovery is that it's a liquid that you're putting onto your quilt when you mark it. So as long as you rinse it out when you're done, in other words, rinse your quilt, block it, square it up on the floor, hang it over a shower curtain to dry, those, once the liquid is out and gone out of your quilt, it's not going to come back. I just have never had a bad experience with that. I have had a bad experience with a blue marking pen, but only because I marked a quilt and then I set it aside and didn't get back to it for 2.5 years. And by the time I got back to it, it was, the fabrics really had, the ink really had set up on the quilt, so I couldn't get those markings out. Whatever you decide you want to do. There's another marking tool that I like called Soline Pencil, and it has a black and white marking in it, and it works really great, but you do have to wash that out. It doesn't just go away. So the friction pen actually will iron out, and it stays long enough for me to get my quilting done. So this entire quilt, the white background was completely black with marking before we pressed it and finished it up. But I like that because it gives me a roadmap for what I want to do. So I'll give you one of my quilting friends, Amy Bouchard from Cascading Quilts, excuse me. She is a phenomenal quilter, custom quilter, and she helped me with this quilt and got it all marked and showed me some fun, helpful hints. So I'm going to share those with you. You'll notice in the corner that we started with a straight line that is at an angle to the corner, and that's what we started our quilting motif for the border with. And these lines are 1 inch apart, every inch, and you start on one side and you're going to start marking towards the center. Then we're going to go to the other corner and start marking towards the center. And in Amy's famous words to me, you mark the left side, you mark the right side, and then you hash it out in the middle. And that's exactly what we did. We made a couple of adjustments to the width of the lines to make sure that that was straight. And then we did the same thing on the sides and the top and bottom. So this entire quilt top was marked and ready before we ever put a stitch on it. I spray based my quilts. I spray based them on the floor. If you have a long arm and or a sit down where you can do sit down quilting, you may not need to spray baste them. On a long arm, you can just stretch them on the frame to be the way they need to be. But since I'm doing this on my Bernina 770, I needed to spray baste it and spray the batting only. Never spray your fabric. So you lay it all out on the floor. I have a low loft carpet here, and I pin my back to the floor. I lay my batting out, I put my quilt top on top of it, and I find a friend that can still get down on the floor and back up again at the same time. And we go on either side, and you spray the back of the batting first and get that all smooth, and then you spray the top of the batting second and get the quilt top smooth on the batting. Never use 505 spray or whatever basting spray you like on the fabric of your quilt. Always put it on the batting. Once you've got that all done, you can trim your backing to about 1 inch all the way around, and if you're doing this on a sit-down domestic machine, you're ready to go. You will have marked your quilt before you baste it all together, before you spray baste it all together. Some of you may want to baste it with your sewing machine or baste it on a long arm before you start sewing if you don't, or quilting, if you don't like to spray baste. But I love to spray baste. It lasts forever and it gives me the time that I need to get the project done the way I want it. So we started at the top, and the other thing you'll notice is that we did, sometimes it's not about spacing these out 1 inch apart. Sometimes it's about, okay, here's our target. Look at the top of this half square triangle, and we're going to use that as the marking or the target for stitching this line and this line and this line, and then we come in the middle between those two with a secondary line to give you this effect all the way across. We did the same thing on the inner border. We marked it at each of these intersections and then added a line, and we quilted from the left all the way over to the right. Now, when we got to this spot right here, it was a real challenge to think, what are we going to do? How are we going to quilt the rest of this? And Amy's suggestion, and I thought it was perfect, was instead of coming up with something completely different, let's do what she calls shadow quilting, which is creating the same design that we had in this square in every square over. And again, we're going to space that out so that it works perfectly, and doing the same shadow quilting all the way across that row, and it worked out just beautifully. It also gives us the ability to follow this quilting motif all the way across, and so it works out really, really nice. So we did this whole first section all the way across. Then we got down to the second section, what I will call the second section. And what do we do with the stars? In a normal star block, you can go from point to point and quilt each star point. The problem with this wonky star block is that it creates a huge gap here on one side of every star point. So on those star points, what we did was we just added an extra line from here to here. And each one of these, this is something that you'll want to make a personal choice about. And that is, do I put a knot in it, or do I use my securing function on my machine, or do I just leave the threads long and sew them away? Now, it's a tedious process to sew all those threads away, but I sew them all away because it gives it the best look. It gives it the look of hand quilting in that you don't have securing stitches sitting on top or behind your quilt. So each one of these was finished off, each star was finished off, and then we did the lines from here to here, and here to here, and here to here, and here to here separately. On the inside of the quilt, you can see that the first sewing line, or first quilting line, goes all the way across and catches this corner, which is really cool. And same thing here. So we've caught the corners on all four edges, but we still have this gap in the middle. So with your curved ruler, I don't remember which one I used now. Let me see, I think it was this one. Yeah, it's a good measure curved ruler, that's the 10-inch. You can mark a center point on all four sides, and then use the curve to go back and forth, and then down and over and over and over and over and over. So you only have 2 stops when you're doing that center part. That's a really fun way to do it. You'll notice that we used variegated thread in the colored portions of the quilt, and then we used white thread or cream thread to match the background. The other thing that we did was we used, I love the curved ruler, so we used the curved ruler quite a bit on the star points. And what you have to do is you have to find a point that you can line up with. In this case, we lined up with the star points here and then just split the difference in the middle. and we lined up with the intersections here. So that's how you do all the way around. So you'll notice that not every single one of my quilting lines is exactly spaced the same, but it's the overall effect of the curves going in the right direction that make it such a beautiful quilting job. Okay, next we're going to just realize that we have once we get all those curves done, we've got this gap in the middle of this large white space in the center here. So we did the same thing. We just went an inch away from this line and created a one-time curved center motif. So that's how you fill up all that space. Now there are places where you can double back on your quilting so that you don't have as many starts and stops, and a lot of those places are places like over here in the border. You can double back and do this line and then go over and do this line and go up in the ditch and over. It doesn't show up on the front of the quilt. It shows up a little bit on the back of the quilt, but it's a personal choice on whether you're going to go ahead and double back on that or if you want to do each line individually. No matter what you do, getting it finished is the ultimate goal here for this project. And so again, we're going to start at the top and we're going to work our way down. But mark your quilts before you get started on them so that you know things fit, especially if you're doing ruler work. If you're doing free motion quilting, it's a little bit different, but my focus and emphasis is to get you guys using rulers and getting these done. Thanks for your time.